Okay, so as I showed in the last video, there'd be absolutely no problem in the Treasury selling bonds to the central bank that are equivalent to the amount of money it's created by spending more than it gets back in taxation. There'd be no problem with that system at all. Unfortunately, that's illegal, courtesy of laws written by politicians being advised by economists who don't understand money. So we have a much more convoluted system these days that requires the government to sell bonds not to the central bank, but to the private banks, and then after that's done, the central bank can buy bonds off the private banks. And also, the central bank, the government is required to pay interest on the bonds, though it can choose how much interest it pays. So I've got to include interest payments on bonds inside there as well. And in that particular case, I'm going to argue that the net buying of bonds by the central bank is roughly equivalent to the interest payments. So let's go through doing the changing this to fit the real world rather than what would be a much simpler system. So I'm going to right click here on bonds, and I'm using two screens here as I mentioned before, so consequently some menu items appear way on my second screen rather than the first where you can't see them. So I bring it up here, I'm going to right click and then choose rename all instances. I'm going to change that from being bond sales by the Treasury to the private bank, to central bank, to bank sales by the Treasury to the banks. So that will now rename that particular element both here and in the two elements where it turns up in the tables. And of course, it's wrongly classified right now. I'm showing that as being bonds being sold to the Treasury when in fact it's being sold to the central bank. So I'm going to bring up the Treasury table and create an additional liability. And this is now going to be bonds owned by the private banks. So I'm just going to type bond subscript B there. And now I need to delete this entry from here and paste it over there. Still the same outcome. Now, of course, this particular row here is no longer relevant. So it's not the Treasury selling bonds to the central bank. I'm going to delete that operation and bring it over here to the banking sectors table and show this as uh, if I now click and add a room for an additional asset here, then I now want to create an asset, which are going to be, which we've already created the liability, pardon me, over here of bonds owned by the private banks. If I click on this down arrow, I now see that particular operation turning up there. So there are bonds owned by the banks, and I've actually, by deleting the row over here, I deleted the row here too in Treasury. So let's go back to the Treasury one here. So bond sales by the Treasury to the private banks should now turn up in that table. And if I can, hasn't turned up physically yet, but let's bring it over here to the banking sector table. Okay. Okay. So I've got actually, I might delete the entire roll of Treasury sales to the banks. Pardon me, getting a bit confusing here. Let's just get rid of that one. So what I want to now have is, let's just see what I've got into the tables. I want to delete that line for the Treasury there. So let's go back to the Treasuries table. Where are we? I haven't got it running. Okay, so I've got to bring that up again. Right click and choose open this godly table and delete that row. This is more complicated than I need to do if I was actually designing a system right from the outset. Of course, it's um, made complicated because I'm trying to explain how our crazy laws came about. So what I'm going to have now is Treasury sales to banks, and that's going to be increase the amount of money they've got in their um, the liability of the Treasury to the private banks. That's sales of bonds by the Treasury to private banks, which then turns up as money, as funds rather, in the account of the Treasury at the central bank. And now we come back over to the private banks, the banking sector. So, okay. Again, there are some elements where the program moves too slowly, so I needed to force it to bring up that particular transaction. Now, how do the private banks pay for the bonds. Well, if you go back and take a look at the previous model, I had, because of the government running uh, a deficit, so creating fiat money, deposits were rising and so were reserves rising. And that's what you can see in this line here. So the government, essentially, the private banks are going to buy the bonds off the government using the reserves that have been created by the deficit spending in the first instance. So the reserves are going to fall, but that's normally okay by the banks because they get an asset which earns income. So I've got treasury sales to the bank there. Now what I've got to include is paying interest on those bonds, so interest on bonds. And that is going to be something which improves the equity of the banking sector. So I'm going to have INT paid by the Treasury to the banks over here. And that therefore means, of course, the reserves have to rise. So that's the balancing asset where that money turns up. Interest by the Treasury paid to the banking sector. And now I go to the central bank. I have to show, and you can see how Minsky creates these interlocking tables. So you've got to make sure all the tables are consistent with each other. So when you enter one, you've got to make it consistent on one of the others. So let's see if I got the central bank. Yes, I have. The central bank window is here. Okay, so um, those operations have turned up. Again, I had to force it by pressing the plus key. We'll have to get that to be more easily done in the future. So interest on bonds also comes out of the Treasury's account at the central bank. I've got that. And now I've got to go to the Treasury table. The Treasury table is up here. Again, I'm going to force it to show that previous operation. So interest on bonds, and that causes more negative equity for the Treasury. So the Treasury, in effect, is creating money, creating an income stream for the banking sector by selling bonds to it and then paying interest on those bonds. Now, I know some MMT people say that means the natural rate of interest should be zero. But I think it's arguable that because the private banks maintain the payment system, if they only got an asset which returned no income, which reserves used to be in the before the financial crisis in 2008, then they'd be maintaining the cost of the payment system without getting any recompense from the government for creating it. In a sense, the interest payments by the Treasury to the banks compensate the banks for the cost of maintaining the payment system. I have had some people say, well, they should be making money out of the payment system, but that's when they get us caught up in Ponzi schemes. So I'd rather reduce the encouragement for banks to entice us into frivolous debt and instead say if you're going to lend money, you should be lending it for productive purposes, not for speculation. And if you're making income out of it, the payment system alone, there's less pressure on the banks to make that frivolous income by persuading us to invest in Ponzi schemes like out of control share prices and out of control house prices. Anyway, that is now a functional system, but I have to now include the interest payments and the Treasury buying those bonds. So I've got a few more elements for the model to add together here. So I now have bond sales by the Treasury to the banks. So I take a click on that. That is now going to be equal to fiat. So get hold of fiat over here. There you go. But it's also going to be the interest payments. So I choose interest on paid by the Treasury to the banks. And so the bonds that are being sold are going to be the sum of those two. So I type, if there was a multiply key, I want a plus key, so I'll just delete that. Okay, this key is here. So add fiat and interest payments to bonds. Okay, so that is implied, of course, I've got it defined up here. That's my mistake. I've currently got it going straight across there. So I'm just going to delete those two. And now Minsky will let me assign it over here because I'm now defining bonds separately. I haven't defined interest on treasury bonds yet, but that's going to be equal to the outstanding bonds owned by the banking sector, which is bonds subscript B, multiplied by the interest rate on bonds. So I want to bring a bond subscript B here, and I now want to have an interest rate on treasury bonds. So I'm going to call this I'll call it R for just for now. Actually, no, I'll call it int subscript rate superscript B for bonds. Make that a parameter. Give it a value of 0 initially, and I'll explain why I've done that in a moment. Maximum of 20%, minimum of 0 again, and a step size of 1%. So now if I multiply the interest rate on the amount of bonds, currently that's 0, that then it becomes interest that's paid on bonds. And then what I'm going to have as well is the Treasury, the central bank buying some bonds in the open market operations it does with private banks. And in that process, buying bonds that are equivalent to the interest payments on existing debt. So I'm going to add one more row here. So central bank bond purchases. You call it OMO for open market operations, which is how they actually get involved in doing this buying. So in this case, that means we're going to have the bonds being sold by the banks to the central bank, and that's what I'm indicating by the superscripting there. So the monetary value of the bonds the banks hold falls. That means the monetary value of the reserves they have has to rise by the same amount, because that's where they get paid by the central bank by entry into their account at the central bank, and uh, that operation increases their reserves. So now I come back over here to the central bank window. Again, it hasn't updated yet, so press one of these keys and force it to show the extra operation. So bonds being sold by the increasing the liability of the banking sector of the central bank. It has an unlimited ability to do that because it can literally create as much money as it likes by these operations. So now I show that's how the central bank gets assets. It buys bonds off the private banks. I'm going to keep it at the level it's just pay the interest payments they get paid. And now I have a complete system. I'll just take a look at each of the elements there. So all the rows sum to 0 as is required. Bank equity starts at 10, private equity at -10. The government has 0 equity. Let's just actually make the window larger. And now if I hit the run key, I'm going to start with no fiat money or credit money creation. So we're completely in a stable system. Now I'm going to put the interest rate on bonds. Of course, no bonds are there at the moment. I'll put it up at, say, 3%. Still no change in the overall system. And now we're going to have the government issuing a deficit equivalent to 1% of GDP. And you have a growing system. Uh, if you have the opposite happening where the government is trying to reduce its spending by running a surplus, you cause the GDP to fall and collapse. And in fact, there's still money creation going on because of those bonds. That's now turning up in the equity of the private banks, who are getting more and more equity over here, as you can see, while the private sector is going negative because the government's taking money out of their bank accounts. Well, let's just reserve that what is actually a stupid mistake, and so let's actually run a deficit again. And we're back having a growing GDP once more. But not understanding these basic dynamics is why we're having farces like the debt ceiling debate in America right now and all the panicking about government debt. A government that is issuing debt denominated in its own currency can issue as much debt as it likes. To my way of thinking, it's the trade deficit that's the confining element for the government, not its fiscal deficit. So that's a pretty quick illustration of how to use Minsky to rapidly explain money creation and to have show the relationship between the private money creation, government, and so on. There's a lot more you can do with it. Dive in and learn.